Morning.
Morning.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. I'm on time. At least according to my GPS. It's 8:03, and I delayed.
Yeah. Almost
GPS
on
says
time.
8:03.
Yeah, not bad, not bad. And the coffees are already ready.
Man, you've been busy.
Woo!
Like my new tire, not flat.
With an actual 18-inch tube in it?
Yeah, proper.
This tire's hot, man.
I was smoking it a little bit. Is it?
It's really hot. You got any air in it?
As much as I put in yesterday.
Front is warm, but the rear is pretty toasty, man. It's good, it's ready.
I am.
As you can see, Chris and I were wimping out again and taking the truck.
It's good.
We ready, Freddy?
Ready.
Yeah, let's hit it.
Now, part of the rationale for taking the truck was that Chris's final drive still had all that excess play in it, and we weren't quite sure how that was going to resolve itself since we hadn't found the parts to fix it, or nor the time. So we figured, why not trailer the bike closer to the trails, and then, if it all went horribly wrong, at least we wouldn't be skidding down the highway, hopefully, at 100 kilometers an hour with a locked rear tire. As you saw from the intro piece, Chris had actually unmounted that $50 mystery tire, taken out the 21-inch tube that he'd been using for the last few rides, and put in a proper 18-inch tube. So we were making some progress with Chris's bike in terms of getting it back to being properly set up. Now, as far as today's ride goes, sometimes when we have a ride, we'll do a little research, we'll sniff around on the net, we will find some GPS tracks somewhere. But on this particular day, we decided to just revisit some of our old haunts and perhaps keep an eye open to see if there was any trails that we'd missed over the last few years in this area. Now, if you look on the right, coming up, there's a hydro line, and right there's a gap in those rocks, and there's a little bit of gravel heading up that hill. Chris obviously spotted it too, so we had a little powwow, but I remembered a few years back that we had actually driven in there, and that basically it was about a loop of 500 meters. Not a bad little loop where you kind of drop down a few rock ledges, but it wasn't really worth making a detour for, so we kept on our way. One thing that's distressing for us to see is how some of our favorite areas are getting developed. And this is one of those bad signs right here. This used to be kind of this crazy tight corner, and you can see they came in here, they widened the corner to make it quite a bit more gentle, and this is a sign that this is becoming more of a general use road. The quality of the road is also improving because there's more construction and cottages and homes being built here, which is never good news for us. We were getting closer to where the gravel starts, so of course this is a pretty common sight in the modern age. A bunch of guys staring at screens, trying to figure out if there's anything here that we haven't been down before. So we're looking on this road down to the left to see if it could possibly go anywhere. It looked like it dead-ended at a lake with a bunch of cottages, so definitely not the kind of place we were looking for. Frequently I'll make fun of Chris because he doesn't carry a very comprehensive toolkit, and sometimes it seems as if his bike could use a little more maintenance. But on this day, I needed to tighten up my clutch lever, which had been rotating around a bit, so I decided to whip out the tools. And Chris, of course, who doesn't carry a tire pressure gauge, borrowed my pressure gauge to check the tire pressure in his newly installed rear tube, which was something like 30 plus psi, which was too high. And once we had our bike sorted out, we put our tools away. You'll notice here that I'm using these straps called rock straps, R-O-K. And no, they're not a sponsor and they've never sent me any rock straps for free, but I really like them because instead of just being a standard nylon webbing strap, a section of it is elastic. So when you strap down something like a waterproof bag, eventually the air leaks out of that bag and it can get substantially smaller, and because of the elastic in the rock straps, it'll take up the slack and your stuff won't bounce around. So, highly recommended. Since my tire pressure gauge was already out, I decided I'd give mine a check, and I find the F800 a little bit sensitive to tire pressure, at least for me. I'm running a D606 here in the front, and I find if I go from 28 to 22, it makes a big difference in the handling. And I wonder sometimes when people talk about the harshness of the front end on the F800, if some of that is dependent on the tire they're running and also the pressure. And I'd rather run a little bit lower pressure. The bike just seems to handle a lot better, and then if I hit a rocky section, I just slow down. Now, anytime a road has a sign that says use at your own risk, you know that that's going to be a good road. You hear sometimes people talk about comfort food, and I think this road for us, this trail area, is kind of our comfort trail. This was one of the first places we ever came when we started riding off-road in 2010. And whenever we quite don't know what to do, or we don't have a lot of time, we'll just come back here. So this is kind of our comfort trail. And every now and then, surprisingly, we will find a little section of this or something not far from here that we've never discovered before. And today, we decided to take a leisurely pace and take some time to see if there was any little offshoots here that we hadn't explored on previous weekends.
Hey, look at that.
One of the things that can be a bit tricky to figure out is when you see a sign that says private, is it the land that's private on the side of the road, or is it the road itself? Now this looked like somebody's driveway or trail, so there was no mistaking this for an actual municipal road. And as soon as we saw that sign, well, I think Chris missed it, I honked because, you know what, I don't want to be rolling into someone's cottage and getting them upset because a couple of motorcycles are there. So as soon as we have any indication that somebody doesn't want us to be there, then we get the hell out of there. As you can see, it was kind of a rainy, crappy day, but I don't really mind riding in the rain. Actually, I prefer it somewhat to riding on a really, really hot, dusty day. And the conditions on this road, when it's a little bit moist, are actually better than when it's really dry. Everything kind of stabilizes, and the traction seems to be much more uniform. And because we're only an hour or so away from home, and in this case we're only about 20 minutes away from the truck and trailer, you're not really worried about getting wet and cold, because you can pretty much survive anything for a half an hour ride. And that would be about the max it was going to take us to get back to the truck.
Yeah, but you know what? I could swear all these had private signs. Because we've never gone down there. We would have. Anyways, no sign.
I had a memory of there being a sign on that tree saying private, but it wasn't there any longer, so I'm not sure if it was a sign indicating that the land was private or the road was private. Sometimes hunters will put up signs too that say, you know, that they were in this area hunting to kind of give you a heads up. And a lot of those guys, especially the hunters, they don't take the signs down. So there can be these kind of old tattered signs and you're not really quite sure what they say. But as I'd mentioned before in some of our other videos, if someone really doesn't want you down their laneway or their little trail, it's pretty easy for them to either put a gate or at least post some half-decent signs. So when we don't see anything really blatant, we kind of assume that they won't be too upset to see us. Now, I know there's people that are going to disagree with that, who are going to say that, well, you should always get permission from the landowner. But realistically, the process for finding out who owns this piece of land and tracking them down is not all that easy, especially if you're not a local. And when you get into a place like this and you see tire tracks from Jeeps and ATVs and other motorcycles, we can kind of assume that whoever owns this piece of land, if they haven't gone through the trouble of posting a single sign saying don't come in here, then they're probably not too worried about it. The flip side of that is that we try to be relatively quiet. So we have aftermarket exhausts on some of our bikes, but they're not crazy loud. And we also don't try to make too much of a mess. So if we do have a piece break off one of our bikes, or we stop to have a snack, we don't leave the garbage laying around. Because I'm sure if the landowner comes out here and sees a couple of tire tracks in the sand, he may not be super excited about that, but I'm sure he'll be even less excited if he finds a bunch of garbage and a fire pit, or a bunch of empty shell casings, or smashed TVs that people have been shooting at, which are all things we've seen in various trails and sand pits around this area. And then a few years later, when those things are all gated off and posted, everyone seems surprised and wonders why that happened. There's always something fun about getting to a Y junction.
Interesting. I don't know, someone went straight ahead there.
It's like being on some sort of reality show where you've got to make a choice and you don't know what's behind door number 1 or what's behind door number 2. So you just take a guess and off you go. A lot of the time we'll forget to come back and see where that other branch goes, and I'll be watching a video years later and I'll see that we found some interesting trail, and at 3 or 4 intersections we chose left or right, and it'll dawn on me, why haven't we gone back and checked out all those other potential little mini adventures? Maybe that trail to the right led to miles and miles of interesting trail. In this case, the branch to the left was certainly taking us down a nice little section of trail, and off on the left I could see there was some water, some sort of lake or something. Having a trail running along the water can be really nice if you end up with some spectacular views, but it can also be a bit of a problem because along the water is where people like to build cottages and to develop, and sometimes those are the people who don't want you around. If we get a little farther away from the city and it's a little bit less of cottage country and more people who live in the country, then things tend to be a bit better, because a lot of those people are avid ATV riders and snowmobilers, and those are the same people who don't seem to mind when a couple of BMWs purr by their house at 9 a.m. on a Sunday morning. Another Y junction and another choice, and Chris chooses the steep uphill to the right.
Oh, it's the one we came down that time.
This is really rocky, and now I'm remembering that somehow we had come out this trail.
You think we're gonna make it up there?
Years ago we had gotten to this, but we had come from the other direction. And given the conditions today, and that hill to the right was quite steep, I thought maybe this was not going to be the way to go, because the memory of coming down this trail from the other direction was that there were some very, very steep sections.
Yeah, all right. Let's give it a shot. From a dead stop, it'll be interesting.
So Chris, not easily dissuaded, decided he was going to give it another shot, and as I just said on the camera there, from a dead stop with no momentum, this would be interesting.
No.
We hadn't gone very far when Chris, who could see up ahead, decided that this was not the day to tackle this in the wet. And there was some downed tree or something up there. So it was time to pull a U-turn and see if there was another way out of this trail without doubling back. The other option at the last Y junction led us down this really smooth ATV trail. I don't think there was anybody driving a Jeep or a truck down this trail. It was far too narrow. And as you can see, there had been some tire traffic down here, but not since it had started raining. And this little causeway we're on, I had the feeling it was man-made. It was just a little too neat and tidy and exactly the width of a trail. And then up ahead I could see it was almost like an island that had a cottage on it. And even though there was no sign, it looked like someone's private little setup. And I didn't want to just roll into their front yard. So I decided to hang a Yui once again and head back. I was also a little curious because Chris hadn't caught up to me yet, which was kind of odd. So I was wondering if he had just gone back the way we'd come. But then up ahead, I caught a glimpse of him just out of the left-hand side of my eye, and I heard that horn beep.
Man down.
I tried to find a little better spot to turn around and leave my bike because I didn't want to leave it down at the base of this hill. And that's kind of our signal when someone's down, is to beep the horn. I thought it was a bit odd because from my initial look at where Chris was, it didn't look like a really tough spot.
You okay?
But sometimes the bike just falls on you, and these are heavy bikes, and it's just easier to wait for help. And he was just caught in a weird spot where his boot was wedged under there, his knee was kind of stuck. So instead of forcing and potentially hurting himself, he just decided to sit tight and hope that his buddy wouldn't abandon him.
Go to someone's cottage.
So far, we've had a pretty good record of not losing any of our members out in the forest. If you've ever done any group riding, you'll be familiar with this pose, the I don't want a rock in my face move. And the HP2 is very good at throwing rocks, especially when Chris actually has a tire with knobs on it. We doubled back to the last Y junction. You can see our tire tracks, and this time we decided to go left.
Might as well.
Chris takes the lead.
Nice hill climb.
It's funny watching the video, you can barely tell this is a hill,
Slimy.
but if you hear the motor, the old 800 is climbing.
That was good.
And within short order, we were at the base of a really gnarly looking climb. Here you can see Chris looking back,
I don't think that's going to be happening.
and that was my vote.
Yeah.
Once again, that doesn't look very steep, but it was one of those hills, because we've been back since this video, and we've tried to make it up that hill. And I think out of 4 bikes, the only guy who made it up was on a WR 250. So that hill is steep. We doubled back and took what I guess you'd call the main road farther along until we came to the little sand pit that, if you've watched any of our videos, you should be quite familiar with. And it's always nice too, as part of our comfort trail theme, to just zip up this sand pit and zoom around for a bit for old time's sake. You can see somebody had a fire pit there. I don't think this pit is actually actively used for anything anymore. There never seems to be any material removed. Chris pulled up beside me and mentioned that farther along there was a road he wanted to check out that he had spotted a couple of times before and he thought might be worth exploring. So we decided to zip down to the end of this road and take a look. There's a bridge up here on the right, which has a water crossing just beside it, which we've done quite a few times. So I always like to slow down and see how deep it is. It didn't actually look too deep, but I wasn't really in the mood to get my feet wet, so we just continued. That's one of those moments where, of course, if Chris had veered off and decided to do that water crossing, then I would have had to do the water crossing, and vice versa. And that's the beauty of peer pressure. About 10 minutes later, we were back on pavement, and we were following Chris. And this was all based on his hunch that he had either heard something or read something somewhere that there was some trail near here that would be worth checking out. Five minutes later, Chris's hunch had paid off, and we were riding down this trail in the woods that we'd never been down before. It was pretty mucky and greasy.
Uh-oh. It's greasy, boys!
I could see Chris's tire tracks were looking pretty squiggly, and then I could see Chris's bike laying on the ground.
Nice zigzags!
Chris had gotten a bit squirrely in that wet patch and decided to head off into the forest. Luckily, he didn't get too far into the rhubarb. A few minutes farther down the trail, another Y junction.
Oh, that's probably the road we saw the entrance.
So at this point, you're kind of guessing. I mean, you have your GPS. You can see where the main roads are. You can see where lakes are. And here you can see that if you wear glasses, at some point it becomes a bit of a pain, because when you're looking through a wet windshield, a visor that's wet on both sides because you've had the visor up, and a pair of glasses that are wet on both sides, it gets a little hard to see the trail ahead. Well, Chris made it through, so I guess I was going to have to give it a shot. I decided to go with a slow and steady approach on this. And as opposed to trying to make my own trail, I just chose a rut and stayed with it. And quite frequently on these big bikes, as long as the rut's not deep enough that you start dragging things, it works out quite well. Some sort of a hole up here that Chris skidded around. Now this trail actually was angled to the right, and I didn't just want to slide down into that hole. In hindsight, if I just kept my speed up, it would have worked out well. And then the trail unceremoniously dumped us back out right at the exit of the gravel road that we started from. Chris, however, was not satisfied. He was convinced that we had missed something, that there was something back there that we needed to check out. So with Chris in the lead, we headed back for take 2. Less than 10 minutes later, we were riding down another trail that somehow seemed familiar. And once again, I'm not sure if it's because we had done this trail years ago coming the other direction, or if this was a trail that had been used perhaps on one of the organized rides we've been on. Either way, I guess it didn't really matter. All that mattered was we'd found a nice trail, and it didn't seem to be ending anytime soon. And then we were presented with another dilemma. The ATV tracks seemed to have gone left, but this hill climb was just a little too tantalizing, so I chose right. I could see traces of tire tracks, but they were hard to make out on the rocky section. As soon as I saw this downed tree, I could tell no large vehicles had been down here in a while. And then up here, when the ground got softer, it was pretty apparent that people had been here recently.
ATV, that's a motorcycle. So someone was down here in ATV and a bike by the looks of it. No.
The tire tracks meant that there were other folks out enjoying this fine Sunday morning who were just as intelligent as we were. The trail started running downhill, and I could actually see little mini rivers running in the ruts. I had chosen the wrong side of the trail, and it was pretty rutted out, deep enough that I would probably get stuck with the 800. And I'd looked for a spot to cross over, and this looked like it.
Yes.
But I kind of botched it, didn't get enough speed up, and then went to put my foot out, and there was nothing but air, so I decided to just get the hell out of the way. It's not as if the 800 hasn't fallen over before.
I'm not going down there under that. That's my bad hand.
I'd fallen twice on the same thumb the week before, so my right hand was still not up to scratch, and I was having a little bit of trouble hanging on, and I certainly didn't want to injure it again. That tends to make you a little more cautious, and sometimes being a little more cautious just lends itself to you falling down even more.
Yeah. I think if I'd just been very aggressive, I probably could have made it. But I wasn't feeling overly aggressive.
With Chris's 2 good hands and my 1 good mitt, we got the 800 up. One of the nice things about a fuel-injected bike is that even if it's been upside down, just like magic, you seem to flick the switch and it starts. And I have memories of carbureted bikes being upside down or on their sides for any amount of time, and then a lot of cranking going on trying to get them started. We had a lot of problems with carbureted bikes on rides over the years. I've become a huge fan of fuel injection. I know the argument is out there that carburetors are so much simpler and they're easier to repair. My counter argument to that would be that unless you're carrying all the parts necessary to repair a carburetor on the trail, you're not really fixing it out here either. And a mechanical fuel injection system is just way more reliable. When it comes to the F800 GS, I've been reading the forums on the internet for years and years and years where people complain about everything. The crappy suspension, the soft front wheels, the bending shock bolts. I mean, if there's a flaw with this motorcycle, there's a lot of people on the internet sniveling about it. And one thing that never comes up is issues with the fuel injection.
Ooh, greasy.
According to Chris's GPS, this trail had dead-ended quite a ways back, but he could see other trails in the area. So this was turning out to be quite a little discovery. The age-old question, do you want to go first? Yeah, why not?
Buggy.
But I hadn't gone more than a few dozen meters when I saw what looked like a really nasty downhill.
I think there's a bypass. Yeah.
This was definitely not the kind of obstacle we were just going to plunge into head first, especially on a trail that we didn't even know had an exit. Someone had been through here, I don't know if it was on ATVs or Jeeps, and this was a steep hill, and had torn it up. And I guess they had at some point created this bypass, and this bypass looked pretty fresh. So I guess the ATV boys had had enough of that hill climb on the right and had bashed their way through here and created a bypass. And this bypass was that kind of dark black, almost garden soil, which can be really slippery. The bypass looked doable, but I wanted to go over and check out the actual downhill, and it's really hard to see, but I'm walking along this ledge, and the drop off into those little trenches on the right is probably 2 feet deep. This little stream that's running on the right there, that's about a 2-foot drop down into that hole, and the ledge I'm walking on is slightly cambered to the right. You definitely would not want to get a 500-pound motorcycle stuck down in that trench, and here it was really nasty. On the left here I could see the exit from the bypass. Looks like there was a couple of exits to the bypasses. There's a look back up the hill. One thing's for sure, there was no way we were going up that hill. The consistency of this dirt was really greasy and clay-like, so there was no way we were going up this hill. The bypass didn't look too bad, so potentially if this dead-ended, we might be able to get back up the bypass. At times like this, I wonder what the experience would be like if you were riding solo. I guess if you were on a small bike and you were a very adventurous type, you would probably just forge ahead. But I'm always a lot braver when I know I've got a couple of guys with me, especially guys who can pull on a piece of rope. This was what the trail looked like after the bypass would dump us out. And there's a look back. The rain was coming down a little harder now, and everything was just dripping. It was really humid, but it was nice. It was actually kind of a fun kind of a fun moment, because at this point you've given up on being dry, you've given up on being clean, and you can kind of just embrace it. So now if you fell off this ledge into that stream, it wouldn't really matter, because at some point you just can't get any wetter. Now here's a great example of what the GoPro does. This little trench on the left, that's probably 2 feet deep or more. And it's really hard to tell here with that wide angle lens. The same thing here, this little ledge I'm walking on the right. It's narrow, and that's a 90-degree drop off into that rut there. And the same thing, that's a couple of feet deep right there. I'm not sure if this was caused by erosion, or if some guys in Jeeps came through here and did a lot of tire spinning and winching, but this trail really did look torn up. With the decision made to forge ahead, we set off with Chris in the lead. I'm pretty certain if this bypass hadn't been here, we would have turned around and headed back. You can see by the headlight here, it's kind of dark, and this is probably 11 o'clock in the morning, something like that. It was just incredibly overcast, and everything was just green and wet, and it felt a little bit more like being in the jungle than it did being in a forest in Quebec.
I'm good.
My hand had seemed pretty good when we'd left in the morning, but I think a few hours of riding and a few drops and a few bike pickups later, it was getting a little bit tender. I've been riding with Chris for quite a while, but I still sometimes wonder how he makes decisions. He decided to go to the right back there, and there wasn't much of a trail there. I stuck to the left, where the ATV tracks were a little more pronounced. And where I'm about to come out here, the trail was better. And I say better relatively because you could see Chris there just sank in 6 inches on the HP2 and had to spin through that section. Yeah, I can see Chris has thrown a lot of mud there. So when I see the HP2 throwing a lot of mud, and he's got a lighter bike with a good knobby on it, here I am. I mean, the clutch is out here. I'm just spinning. There was just enough traction to get me through that section. Now we're back on the main trail at the base of that really rutted out hill you saw earlier. Now there's a foot some odd deep trench to the left, and there's one to the right with this little ridge in the middle. And the ridge is just wide enough that if I tiptoe, I can keep 1 foot on either side of the bike. And I'm just hoping the bike doesn't slide off into one of these ruts. The one on the right there is probably a foot or so deep. So certainly deep enough to get me wedged in there. I got to the top of this little drop off and decided to just ease the front end down, and then once the front wheel was at the bottom, I could give it a little gas. Then things got a little better. The erosion had seemed to fill this section with sand, and the sand was quite firm. But up ahead was another nasty looking section.
Stay to the right.
Chris up ahead was indicating that the right hand side was the side to take, and this trench was wide enough that I wasn't going to get stuck in it with the 800, so I decided to just embrace it and put the bike right in it. The other nice thing about being down in this trench is it effectively makes the bike a lot shorter because your feet are up on the banks on the ridge here, so it makes it a lot easier to keep the bike stable. I was just hoping that this next section wasn't going to be too narrow and the 800 wasn't going to get wedged in here. One thing to keep in mind here is that I'm actually going downhill. I'm using throttle to go downhill. If you take a look at the water running in those grooves, this is a half decent little incline still. And it's just so squishy that I'm having to use power to go downhill. Now, if I was a better rider or feeling a little more adventurous, this would have been a perfect spot here where I should have just stood up on the pegs and ridden this ridge out like Chris did before me. But with a foot or so drop on each side and my tender mitt, I was really feeling cautious today. And luckily Chris had walked back. You can't see him here, but he's actually holding the back of the bike. Because if he hadn't been there, I would have toppled off one way or the other because my feet were simply slipping out from underneath me. And there's Chris complaining that some a-hole had gone through there and torn it up. And I'm pretty sure it must have been some guys in trucks or jeeps who had done the initial damage because the space between the wheel ruts was just far too big even for it to have been a side-by-side.
1.6 clicks.
As you just heard, the GPS once again was enticing us by indicating that a mere mile away, 1,600 steps away, was an actual road. And I don't know why, but at this moment I was thinking to myself, well, at least the worst of this is behind us. Of course, that was just an assumption because we'd never been down this trail before and we had no idea what lay ahead. It had flattened out, and now we were back on some of that sand that seems to have washed down. Chris gives me a little bit of a spray here. But there must have been some traction in there because he didn't get stuck.
That's nasty.
Could feel the bike just sinking in.
Whoa!
And I actually gave it less throttle and didn't spin. And other than stalling it, it made it through with a little less drama. Now we started going uphill. As it turned out, that nasty rutted out downhill was the worst part of this trail. This was definitely a trail that was going to be on our list to revisit. And maybe if conditions were really dry, it might be fun to try it going the opposite direction. I hope you enjoyed riding along with us today. If you have any questions about the bikes, the gear, anything at all, feel free to drop us a comment here on YouTube. If you'd like to send us an email, you can head over to awesomeplayers.com and you can find our contact information there. If you find the current resale value of your motorcycle is too high, you can also purchase our stickers at awesomeplayers.com by clicking on the order tab. And it being the modern age, of course, it never suffices to be reachable through YouTube and email. You must also have a Facebook page, and we do have a Facebook page, and there's a little bit of traffic over there, and there's some interesting folks, so why not join us there if you have a comment or you'd like to send us a picture or a video of what you've been up to. in closing, we'd just like to thank you once again for joining us on another adventure of the Awesome Players Off-Road Motorcycle Club. Thanks for watching.